Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Welcome to the second episode of the EconTalk Book Club on the Theory of Moral Sentiments with Dan Klein of George Mason University. Our first episode was an overview of key ideas in the book. Today's podcast is focused on part one of the book. Go to econtalk.org/bookclub.html to find an online version of the book, how to buy the book if you want a hard copy, and other resources. And as an introduction to today's podcast, I should mention, and this was a Dan's suggestion, I think it's an excellent suggestion, that this is going to be a very different type of podcast than we usually have. We're going to try to work systematically through a work of greatness it has all kinds of implications for how people thought and behaved and how we think. And so Dan suggested you might listen to it a little bit differently. As he put it, you might want to adjust your notion of propriety, to use some of Adam Smith's language. So we'll see how this goes. This is our first time doing anything like this, and I'm very excited about it. Dan, welcome back.
Thank you, Russ. Glad to be here as always.
So I read part one, and I found it, for those of you who are going to be reading it, maybe haven't read it yet, it starts off a little bit slow and picks up speed for me. I found it much more interesting as it proceeded, although all of it's very interesting. But parts of it are quite challenging. The language is lively in spots, but other times a little 18th century, we might call it. And but I enjoyed it overall. Dan, why don't you get us started?
Okay. Well, I think right off we should mention that in the very first sentence, Smith posits this yearning, urge, interest, and sympathy right off. He says, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So right off the bat, he's positing sort of sociability, concern for others, shared experience, shared sympathy with others, maybe I should say shared sentiment, which perhaps he viewed as different than perhaps Hobbes or Mandeville or Rousseau. Smith does not try to explain this sociability, except in the sense that he explains everything by a providential author of nature, a god, which isn't, in a sense, really an explanation. But so he just posits that and moves forward.
He takes it for granted that we as the reader, by the way, accept it. One thing that struck me at reading this for the first time carefully, and much of it for the first time at all, is how much of it is state assumption, presumption that the world works this way. That there isn't the incredible richness of examples from the real world that's in The Wealth of Nations. There are many examples, but most of them are just casual examples, things that would appeal to our common sense in making his claims plausible.
Yes, and he does expect us to take that as acceptable and given. So this notion of sympathy, I think, deserves a little bit of remark right off. I think of it as mutually coordinated sentiment, that my sentiment and your sentiment kind of converge, are in common, and almost as though the sentiment exists between us, neither yours nor mine, but ours, almost like the beat of a song. If we're keeping time or beating time together, which is one of his common synchronous or musical metaphors. So this notion of coordinated sentiment almost puts the sentiment between us. Okay, that's one reason it's different. It's not atomistic at all, his view of man. It's not like, my sentiment and your sentiment. It's kind of like it becomes our sentiment. And then, of course, that grows outward in all the social interactions. And I think his whole vision of really a liberal civilization. there are a number of ways which he expresses this sense of mutual coordination of sentiment. And many of them, as I've said, are musical or synchronous. He speaks of harmony quite a lot, beating, keeping time together, being in tune, and so on. Another metaphor he uses a lot is entering into, like we enter into each other's feelings, a metaphor of sort of, I suppose, entering into your home or you entering into my home, which again would create a common experience, a kind of sharedness. He also speaks of going along with, again, a kind of mutual coordination. So I think sympathy is basically a mutual coordination of sentiment. I might here remark on sentiment versus passion, okay, because he also speaks of passion. And I think perhaps you can see sentiment and passion as two aspects of emotion, with, I think, passion being a more active sense of emotion. A passion actually stirs you to act, and to do something as a moral agent, as a doer, whereas a sentiment is a more passive, or at least it can be just a more passive aspect of emotion. And the sympathy, sometimes it gets translated as empathy. It's not necessarily, sympathy is not necessarily a wholehearted endorsement and concern for somebody. And it can be that you are sympathetic with aspects of that person's action, feelings, views of the world. So you enter into pieces of it. So he uses sympathy in sort of a broad way. And it depends a lot on imagination. He makes that clear early on. You have to imagine what the situation is of the person you're sympathizing with. You have to imagine what their motives are. You have to put yourself in their position. So imagination, I think, is very central in all this. And it all quickly, from the very beginning, becomes very intangible, which I think is one reason why it's harder to read this book than Wealth of Nations. It's much more tangible in The Wealth of Nations, what he's talking about, much more concrete. He quickly talks about needing to interpret other people's situations, and so he immediately starts hinting at the importance of local knowledge and implicitly, at least, the limitations of local knowledge. So he basically says, that we look to sympathize with each other. We look for others to sympathize with us. At the same time, he very quickly points out that we shouldn't expect people to enter too deeply into our sentiments or our situation if we're the person principally affected. If we're sort of telling somebody about our day or our troubles, he says it always affects you, the person concerned, much more than anyone who you can hope to sympathize with you, and modulating this sympathy or what you expect others to feel is a very important dimension from the outset.
I was struck as if we think about Smith as an economist, which is obviously only part of his repertoire, but in modern economics, Gary Becker is probably the economist most associated with bringing emotion, altruism, which would be one way of translating beneficence, into the standard framework of economic thinking, the caring about others, the economics of the family. Becker wrote his treatise on. And I was struck reading the book how much Smith argues emotion weighs on our well-being as opposed to our material success or failure.
Oh, yes.
So there's an enormous emphasis on a person's happiness, not depending on X1 and X2, which is the textbook version of happiness, that our utility depends on our consumption of goods, but overwhelmingly here, depending on how we are viewed by others and how we view ourselves, which is undoubtedly true, an incredibly important part of our humanity. And he really gets deeply into that, so deep that occasionally one is lost. There's almost a labyrinthine wandering around and repetitive. A couple of times I felt like I was lost in a maze where he's constantly looking at the different combinations and possibilities for one's perception of others, their perception of you. It's really it forces you to think very deeply about where your ultimate satisfactions come from.
Absolutely, and I think the theory of moral sentiments so strongly asserts or affirms the idea that it's principally the moral aspect of our existence that matters to us. There's a number of things, including in passages in part one. In one point, he speaks of as long as you're in good health, out of debt, and have a clear conscience, almost nothing else. Yeah,
that's it. That's top of the line.
If you've got good health, out of debt, and clear conscience. Now, good health and out of debt does depend on material, certainly.
It's a very low standard by modern standards, right? And I was struck, of course, we're living in times where there's a lot of people who aren't out of debt, and that was part of the problems we're in. But that was a fascinating statement, right? That's it. That's it.
Yeah. He says people pursue and they imagine that other things are going to make them a lot happier. And in particular, it's not really even the material goals, but the attention, the sense of importance. Yeah. But all that he sort of even downplays, right? Although in a way he comes back and says it's good that nature put this in us because that leads us to go off and produce and strive and increase the means for people being born and being sustained. So in that larger sense, you also get this feeling that, he thinks it's better to have been born than not to have been born.
Absolutely.
And so the multiplication of the species, just in that very raw sense, is very far behind everything. But there's another passage, just while we're on this, in this section where he says, compared with the contempt of mankind, all other external evils are easily supported. So you can be poor,
bad health,
even bad health, right, and all that. But compared to sort of this bad moral situation,
not just moral in the modern sense of the word, just the contempt of mankind could come from you acting immorally, obviously, but it could come from perception, all kinds of negative perceptions that he talks about at great length. And it's a fascinating idea, right? It's a deep thought.
Yeah, and the idea that economics is all about wealth maximization. Right. And it's so out of step with this work. So I'm kind of, when you come back to me, Russ, and I'm rolling through, I'm kind of going along a page by page set of notes here, because I do think, I guess, our job is to some extent the sort of exegesis of what we think is significant, just rolling through.
Don't call it just rolling through. Rolling through. Go ahead.
So this whole issue of modulation is there, and he says that, one thing we try to learn to do is to modulate our sentiments and our calls to other to a just and proper degree or depth. And he sees that becoming.
I saw that as one of the most provocative and interesting themes of the first part. This idea of it's a harmony idea, right? Mm-hmm. It's this idea that if you are overly, say, grief-stricken, publicly grief-stricken, or overly exuberant about your success, you will reduce the sympathy you receive from others. I think there's a deep truth to that, although at the same time I was struck by how 18th century that was and its concept of what is proper or of propriety. In our world, often we're encouraged to be emotive and to get out your grief, express yourself, your exuberance. But I think even though we have a different attitude toward propriety, the idea of harmony with the feelings of others is deeply true. And that in particular, I was struck by the fact that people who seem to be overly exuberant in joy or overly grief-stricken, if we as the impartial spectator don't feel it merits that response, they forfeit a lot of our sympathies in both directions. I just thought that was extremely that deeply insightful and true in our times.
Mm-hmm. And there's more on that, which we're coming to.
Sorry, go ahead.
Not at all. I think it's worth noting that early on page 17, he speaks, he connects all this matter of sentiment also to opinions, and he very naturally extends it to opinions about things, which is much more of an intellectual matter, but
aesthetics.
Yeah, but
includes aesthetics.
Yes, but I think he also would mean opinions about social matters, and if you want to take it into a political direction about politics. So he again is concerned about having harmony there, and so I think it's very natural to think about his project being, hey, part of what I need to do as Adam Smith is get people's opinions in the right focal point so we can coordinate on them up and down, remember, through all those different sources of moral approval. Remember when I said that in the fourth source, sort of the grand concatenation of society, the great machine, as he might call it, we need to understand how things happen. And I suggested that the Wealth of Nations is part of an effort to get people to see the unseen, how markets work pretty well, how government interventions often don't, and what goes wrong with government. And so all that can be seen as trying to get people's opinions and notions about, say, policy together so that we can be in harmony about what are proper opinions, and then have harmony in that. And when, like I just mentioned while we were warming up, my dad and my stepmom were with me this weekend, and they're way into the Obama phenomenon. And, I don't mean Obama, Bush, whatever this isn't about, but it's like, you actually see it's a very important part of people's lives, everyday people's lives. I mean, politics is a big part of where they find meaning and how they see connecting up to things. And there, you have all these opinions over dinner. It's like, well, I don't think that, but, I don't want to start, having disharmonious conversation and everything else and feeling. But it all relates,
I have to disagree with you a little bit there, and I'll give you a chance later to defend it. But I was struck by the lack of any reference in this material to political views. So much of it was related to the stuff on aesthetics. I found fascinating. Anybody who's ever tried to get somebody to love a movie that and finds out that they don't love the movie that's very disharmonious sometimes, or a symphony or a poem, or you recommend a novel and your spouse or your best friend doesn't like it, and you're crushed or shocked, or you can be angry even. And I'm not sure Smith is willing to concede that last point. But I was struck by how day-to-day these concerns are that Smith deals with. There's a lot of death in the book. There's a lot of he talks numerous times about people who drop dead or killed, murdered. There's a lot more death in 1759 than there is day-to-day than there is in our life. So people coping with that level of grief, of early death, and of course levels of success, which were much more modest in his day. It was harder for people to climb the economic ladder in 1759 in England, Scotland. Anyway, so I'm going to challenge on that. Maybe we'll come back and talk about that. I didn't get much feeling about harmony of political views.
I'm jumping there. But the book does go there, as we mentioned in the first. It does go into some politics. And even in this first part, remember, he does talk about, I think it's in the page 60s, the different roads to rank and distinction, and some that he describes of much more of a political nature.
He has a lot to say about politicians.
Yeah, right.
None of it favorable
he's not talking,
so far.
Right. In his examples about people's opinions and feelings, he's not talking about how they feel towards politicians, but he does say things, the politics does certainly crop up.
And let me back off what I said a little bit. He certainly is extremely interested in what we would call in our time the celebrity phenomenon.
Oh, yes.
Whether they're politicians or rock stars, which he isn't referencing, but or certainly what he writes about politicians would be relevant.
Yes.
Carry on.
I think it's important to make a distinction that he makes. I'm thinking of page 18. It starts, sentiment towards an action proceeds both from the cause or motive of the actor or agent, as well as from its effect or consequences. And the aspect having to do with motives and causes, he speaks of in terms of propriety and impropriety. So when he talks of propriety and impropriety, at least here, it's kind of referring to the motive, what the guy was thinking.
The actor.
Yes. Whereas merit and demerit include consequences, whether we actually consider it meritorious. And there again, you quickly get into stuff which suggests things about local knowledge because motives are so hard and so mixed to know. It's one reason you so much often have to go on merit, right? Mm-hmm. And systems might, just kind of focus on merit, which in some ways seems unfair as he gets into later, especially when chance is playing a role. That's in part 2.
We'll get to that.
But I think it relates to local knowledge problems. So we admire people who well modulate their sentiments when they interact. We often really find them very acute, he says, in the way they gracefully handle those things. That's a source of admiration, he says. We admire their acuteness. And in speaking of this, and in having explained some of the sort of utility of modulating it, he says, though, that the utility is an afterthought. He says that our first liking or admiration stems from this acuteness, from this rightness, okay, from this properness. And this is a big theme throughout the book, that while utility, you can think of some kind of social utility, plays an important role in the evolution of our notions, our moral notions. They're not what originally affects us, okay? And so again, he sees that whatever we think is actually useful, good in terms of utility, and including social utility, some kind of aggregate wealth, common welfare, we kind of have to build a notion of rightness and put that across and understand it so that we can then work from a sort of direct sense of propriety, okay, in our moral reactions, which correspond then to that, we hope, wise understanding of what will be socially useful. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I don't. Try that again.
Throughout the book, he is setting up sympathy and these moral notions of propriety as our kind of original, he often says, our original source or impulse or guide. But it's important that what we're consulting there, some sense of rightness, ultimately be wise in terms of the overall consequences of this guide. Okay, think of an actual guide who's going to frown or smile on certain things. He's sort of saying we create a notion of this guide, even like a face, even if it's imaginary, and it's the frown, it's the immediate sort of frown or smile as we would expect such judgment to be rendered by this guide as we understand it, that really kind of moves us morally, and can move us passionately, and we hope that the guide is a wise guide, that corresponds to things that will actually be socially useful for the whole. Mm-hmm. So this point, this theme of his, that utility, as he puts it, is an afterthought, is kind of behind all this. And you have to look ultimately to some sort of evolutionary mechanism to get convergence behind people's moral notions, this guide, okay, which becomes the spectator, the impartial spectator, and social utility.
Let me say, I think I understand. Let me say, you're saying that you could be in harmony, say, with your neighbor's sentiment in reaction to some event, let me say, that's the wrong direction. Your neighbor could moderate his or her reaction to some event to be in concert with yours. Since you can't feel it as strongly, the fact that the neighbor masks her grief at a loss, recognize that you won't be so sympathetic because it's not your loss, is something that we admire at times and we applaud. But of course, there are lots of things you could synchronize like that would be evil.
Yes.
And so there's in the background some idea perhaps that either in a Hayekian evolutionary sense, the norms that emerge are useful.
Yes.
Or there's some sort of divine or other reason to believe that these norms are good. But the mere harmony by itself is somewhat ambiguous.
Yes.
Is that a good way to put it?
It is. And it's that harmony ought to – he's prompting us, and I think he's suggesting that us as beings who seek enlightenment and wisdom, we are always prompted to sort of check at a higher level whether our harmonies and what we've become accustomed to, our practices, our guides, are actually worth improving.
I hear you.
Okay? And so then we have to think about the broader picture, the fuller understanding of the consequences, consider people who are criticizing our guide, right, to improve it. And so that could be that very process, social process of both intellectual and moral could be the process, could be the evolutionary's cultural evolution.
Right,
sure. But at the end of the day, sort of in the way we act at any given day or week, we're sort of playing off some crystallized, as it were, guide of sort of where we're at now. Where we're at now, right?
Yeah, because I mean the book's very much man as he is. This is what we are. We are. I mean, at various points he steps back, particularly in part 2, and asks, well, is this a good thing or a bad thing that this is the way people feel about this, that, or the other? And he's constantly, not constantly, but occasionally, I would say, looking at what we would call in modern economics the incentive effects. If this is how people respond to this kind of behavior, does it encourage the behavior, reduce the behavior? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I find there's a tension in there between how much he wants to comment on it versus just kind of make an observation and walk away. Every once in a while, I feel that the real man emerges from behind the mask of the author and says, this is really gruesome or this is really delightful. And it's but a lot of times he's going to step back. He's not going to come forward. He's just going to give you his impressions. Yeah. I mean, his observations, not his impressions.
Yeah. My feeling is that he's expressing a great deal his own sensibilities. That's maybe a good word for this. That we're sort of trying to coordinate our sensibilities and then improve and refine our sensibilities. And I really feel that you ought to read his work as to a great extent an expression of his sensibilities. So if someone says, well, what does he mean by propriety? What does propriety actually consist of? It's like, well, it's what's in those entire works. I mean, it's the whole sense you get of what he thinks is, worthy and unworthy.
Having said that, just as one more digression, occasionally as I was reading it, I found myself slipping into a Dickens novel or a Jane Austen novel where I suddenly be an interesting thing to read this book alongside, say, Sense and Sensibility or Dickens' Our Mutual Friend, which is all about how people feel about rich people, how people feel, not just rich people and what they act and how they get rich, but how do people feel about the upper classes? How do people feel about the nobility? And then how does the nobility feel about them? And, we read those novels. I recommend both of those. We read those novels through our modern eyes, and reading it through Smith's eyes really changes the way you read them, because it was a different game. Yeah. The scope for expression for women, say, the scope for expression for a talented man even, is very clear to Smith that its scope was highly constrained. And our time's more open. It's a different time.
What you say, just speaking of Jane Austen and how you have to go to the novels in the 19th century to find this discussion, it's more of a digression on top of yours. Again, Smith is like telling you what his sensibility, he's expressing his sensibilities about sort of the big picture, what this large sense of sensibilities ought to be that we ought to try to coordinate on so that our opinions better cohere and we get policy right. And I think, but I think that quickly after Smith's time, especially as you get political economy as a separate discipline or enterprise, your economists very much lose that sense of expressing this broad, here are my large sensibilities about what the good life is. And I think that's actually a great tragedy. I think that part of the trouble with liberalism and its eventual decline, you really see it decline at the end of the 18th century. But I think, in a sense, the seeds of the problem go back to this, in some ways, separation earlier on, where economists are much more reserved about that, and they want to be, I'm the scientist as the economist. I'm not,
not
trying to express. I'm not trying to exhort.
Right.
That's a whole big thing,
yeah.
But
back to the book.
Okay,
that's great.
So in the page 20s is, I think, the first time he starts speaking of partial and even impartial, and he says that when we are very partial to a matter, it's harder for us to modulate properly, to have that gracefulness, and also to see a larger picture if it's somebody who we're partial to, who is affected. If it's our brother who's involved in a dispute, we're very partial, right? And I just think it's interesting how he starts to use the terms partial and impartial, where, we have our normal understandings of what those words mean, but if you actually examine them closely, it's kind of like part versus the whole. And in a way, impartial means, not that I don't care about either disputant, but I'm sort of seeing the whole, or I have more of a sense of the whole, which I think is a useful vocabulary. I prefer it, for example, to objective and subjective, rather than saying being subjective, I'm partial. And I prefer to say that someone is more impartial when they have a greater sense of the whole, and then they give their judgments and sensibilities about that whole, understanding that they're just somebody who maybe doesn't have a great sense of the whole, but this is where he's coming from. There's something on page 22, which I think is really worth noting. He's talking about this harmony of sentiment, and he says, these two sentiments, however, may, it is evident, have such a correspondence with one another as is sufficient for the harmony of society. So harmony is not some bliss. It's not some perfect convergence. The next sentence reads, though they will never be unisons, they may be concords, and this is all that is wanted or required.
That's a deep thought. It's a musical thought, by the way. For those who are musical, a unison is the two notes that are the same. Concord is a reference to, I assume he was referring to harmony, where two notes sound good together, like a C and a G. Two C's are unison, but C and a G, even though it's not perfectly in coordination with one another, it's still pleasant sounding.
That's right. So it's not perfection, but just a sense of this harmony is all that is wanted or required, which speaks to, I think, his sort of comparativeness. It's like, hey, it's one focal point that works. We don't seem to have one that has a better sense of harmony or a stronger unison. And so, although harmony sounds so blissful and perfect, it wasn't really a sense of perfect convergence, perfect competition, perfect markets, none of that. And so I think Smith is very much in tune with the remaining imperfections and disharmonies, even that are naturally going to be part of society. On 24 is the first time he uses the expression, I think it's the first time, impartial spectator. And he's just referring to a person who's spectating and happens to be impartial, but he's sort of laying stakes for the deeper construct of the impartial spectator, which doesn't actually emerge yet. I don't think it comes up yet until part 3.
He uses I noticed at least 3 different languages to describe this observer. He's got, I think, indifferent at one point.
He does use indifferent at least once.
And there's maybe even a third one. I may not find it quickly, but it's interesting. There is such a thing as elegant variation. It's a writing technique.
Right.
Where rather than repeat the same phrase, you look for a phrase of the same meaning. And Deirdre McCloskey inveighs against that because arguing that it distorts meaning potentially in the reader, who then assumes it must have some separate significance. But my presumption is that indifferent and impartial are the same in Smith's mind.
At least, as these are occurring. I think that's right. There is some elegant variations, and how intentional, whether Deirdre should fault him for that or whether we should fault him for that or not, I don't think it's a simple matter.
Perish the thought.
Right. I do believe, I'm a subscriber to the view that Smith was a very sly fellow, a very sly writer. And not that all of his ambiguities are deliberate and he's got some master resolution in the back of his mind by any means. But I do think that in some cases he didn't want particularly to clarify certain things. And even perhaps wanted to cloak certain things. And certain things about that like about God and stuff, I think remain very ambiguous. And surely, deliberately to some extent so. There is something on pages 23 to 25 I want to speak to. This is, I think, a very interesting distinction between 2 sets of virtues. The amiable virtues and the respectable virtues. He says, the softer, the gentle, the amiable virtues, the virtues of candid condescension and indulgent humanity are found upon the one, the great, the awful and respectable, the virtues of self-denial, of self-government, of that command of the passions which subjects all the movements of our nature to what our own dignity and honor and the propriety of our own conduct require, take their origin from the other. Okay, so there's the amiable, which are gentle, indulgent, compassionate, and then there are the respectable, the great, self-denial, self-government. He associates it with dignity and honor.
Yeah, this is the start of chapter 5 in section 1.
Yes, part 1. Perhaps it's
part 1, section 1.
Okay, okay.
Sorry.
I think this is a quite useful and profound and elemental distinction here. I like to think of the self as using this distinction as I've modeled it as a spiral in something I once wrote. Where on the one side of the spiral, you have this sort of multiplication of the self, this dividing of the self, this conflict within the self, and that's where the gentle and amiable and compassionate virtues are more significant. And then down around the bottom of the spiral, it goes back up towards the next level of the onion, right? Because it's a spiral going down to the middle. And in the middle of this is the soul, okay? So it's kind of like the disintegration of the self. And that's where you need compassion and gentleness and amiableness, to indulgence, to appreciate the person's trouble and the trouble of keeping yourself together and, your different impulses and challenges in life. But then at the bottom of the spiral, it starts going up, and that's the reintegration of, okay, so I have these different impulses, I have these different forces, I have these problems in life. How am I going to reintegrate these into a person that gives them their just due and, manages them properly? He speaks of self-government and self-denial, right? Putting I shouldn't smoke this much or what have you. And so that's the reintegration. That's the awful and respectable. He uses awful in an old sense. Maybe awesome is what we might say. So then you go up to like a new level, which is kind of like a new, better level of self. But then again, life never ends and there's new challenges, and you would be bored just getting in a routine, in a groove of just being that,
controlled.
Yeah, that controlled, integrated person. You want to reach out and expand. And so you come again to the disintegrating factors of the self, where you have new multiplicities and conflicts, and again, call for compassion, and you keep going around and round, and I don't think it ever ends. I think Smith is a very dialectical thinker, and it's all about the whole onion, as it were, the whole spiral, if you will. And these two sides of the spiral, or sets of virtues, correspond perfectly to the kinds of virtues that are called for in interaction. Let's say your house burns down, Russ. I'm your friend or neighbor, and, we're interacting, and you're obviously in a mess and grieving and confused. What do I do? Blah, blah, blah. You're obviously sort of disintegrating, because of this event. You're troubled, you're upset, you're not sure what to do next, what you're going to do about this and that, put things back together. Should I go on with that project? I lost all my notes or what have you. You might have to kind of lop off parts of yourself, right? Certain projects or something, or, someone getting a divorce or what have you. And so for me, the virtues that are needed are these amiable virtues to sort of reach into your troubles and to sympathize with you. And for you, kind of, bringing me in, you need to call more on the respectable virtues, so that it's not like just this huge mass of grief
that you can't relate to,
that I can never relate to fully or know about, and so on. And so it goes, and he says this, it goes to the two sides of an interaction between two people, and again, that modulation of sympathy. He also relates this beautifully, this is on page 25, to the Christian precept of loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. And he kind of says, okay, but you got to look at that from both sides. In one sense, from your sense, you're getting a divorce, or you're getting your house burned down. You've got some troubles.
We pick a different person than me, just because I'm happily married and my house is still standing.
Yeah, Jim. Right, Jim.
Yeah,
sure.
Go ahead.
And right, and Jim has to some extent, I'm Jim's neighbor. He has to understand that he should love me, that he shouldn't impose upon me so much to expect me to grieve so deeply and have me upset my life, and, help him to some, great extent. And so he should, but at the same time, Smith's saying, but, we should also love ourselves only as much as we love our neighbor. I guess that's the one. That's the part that would apply to Jim. Jim, like, all right, let me. I
didn't understand this. Let me read the passage.
Okay,
and by the way, it's a Jewish tradition as well. It comes out of I think it's in Leviticus, but I think it's interesting. Smith attributes it to the great law of Christianity. It says, "As to love our neighbor as we love ourselves is the great law of Christianity. So it is the great precept of nature to love ourselves only as we love our neighbor, or it comes to the same thing, as our neighbor is capable of loving us." I had no idea what he's talking about. I have a question mark next to that passage, so try again.
Okay, so Jim is house burned down, getting divorced or something. I'm Jim's neighbor. The first way of looking at the precept is me, as Jim's neighbor, should try to love Jim as much as I love myself, and I should try to enter into his troubles and grief and assist him.
Feel his pain.
Okay, that's the one way. But the other part, which Smith wants to highlight here, is, but Jim needs to understand that he should love himself only as much as he loves me. So he should modulate all his grief and his, importune calls to me realizing that, he shouldn't love himself so much more than he loves me.
Right, we always put the stress on the direction that it's easy to love yourself, right? So I always say try to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself.
Right.
You're suggesting that you shouldn't love yourself much more than you love your neighbor, which should be a very a very interesting way to think about it.
The modulations are on both ends. Not loving yourself too much and loving your neighbor more to get to some kind of harmony. He's got another statement here of these two sets of virtues that's just worth reading. Is on page 25. The amiable virtues consist in that degree of sensibility which surprises by its exquisite and unexpected delicacy and tenderness. The awful and respectable in that degree of self-command which astonishes by its amazing superiority over the most ungovernable passions of human nature.
Yeah, it's a great summary.
Now, I think Smith, in one point, I'm pretty sure, he actually makes a male-female distinction and lines these up. I think these are what he's referring to as, the compassionate, amiable is more female, and the other one, the more respectable,
self-denial, self-command,
right,
less emotional,
the integration of the self is more male. But,
that would be a traditional interpretation for sure.
Yeah,
very 18th century.
But at the same time, again, the spiral of Smith is saying that we have to be both male and female.
Sure.
It's not like he's recommending, of course, one over the other, or even that the genders should be different in this respect.
While we're on page 25, just the very next thing that comes after that quote you just read is, I think, gets back to the point, at least the way I understood it, you're trying to make between norms and stepping back in utility. He says, there is in this respect a considerable difference between virtue and mere propriety, between those qualities and actions which deserve to be admired and celebrated and those which simply deserve to be approved of. So he's talking about a distinction there between propriety and virtue. Presumably things could be proper and not very virtuous, whereas it's both that we want.
Yeah, and that relates to the distinction we referred to earlier between the grammar and the aesthetic aspirations.
Earlier in the previous podcast?
In the earlier previous. I see a hint there of him saying that these, what he's calling virtue here, are more these aspirational things of beauty, whereas the propriety is, okay, they got their grammar right.
I didn't see it that way. I saw it more, propriety is what becomes the norm of society.
Okay, more of a norm. Okay, a mediocrity. Yes, he does speak of that. The point of propriety.
You do what's expected in a society where not much is expected of people. Where people aren't close to one another. Then your house burns down. You might get a cake the next day, but they're not going to help you rebuild your house. But we might want a world with more insurance, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Moving along, he speaks of decency and indecency. He talks about bodily pleasures. He talks a little bit about sex here. Basically, he says that, these might be real important to you, but don't expect people to enter into them.
They don't care as much.
They can never care as much as you might care about some of that stuff. And that includes, feeling pain and all that.
Yeah.
I'll skip over that. He briefly makes a distinction between temperance and prudence, which I thought was interesting. Temperance being more of a social virtue, more of a display matter, how you handle your sentiments and interactions, whereas prudence is more like how you look after your future self. He says quite a lot about prudence throughout the book, so we'll come back to that. On 31... he talks a little bit about the imagination, and there's a little bit about the ridiculous, which I thought deserved comment. He says, the imaginations of mankind, not having acquired that particular turn, cannot enter into them. That is, when someone has some special image that they think is real important. Other people don't, see it and cannot enter into them, or don't have that much of a commitment or preference for them. And such passions then of the guy who has this image in his head is very important. And such passions, though they may be allowed to be almost unavoidable in some part of life, are always, in some measure, ridiculous. And I don't want to make a big deal of this, but there's, the imagination plays a big role. But I think here there's the suggestion that you can't expect people to rally around something that's only in your imagination, and that's not well put out in front of people, well known, tangible, focal. And if you want them to more, and again, this is where I think more about ideology and politics and everything, you've got to get that imagination, that image better shared. You've got to develop it. You've got to teach people to see propriety in it. But long before doing that, it can just be ridiculous. And in a sense, I think the free society, the whole, sort of ideal of liberalism is often called illusory and ridiculous and a flight of the imagination. Libertarians are often accused of all those things.
Unrealistic.
Right.
Living in a fantasy world could never exist, et cetera.
Exactly. And again, I kind of see Smith as very aware of the challenges and trying to draw this image of a free society more concretely so it's less ridiculous. I want to quote Thomas Paine from The Age of Reason. This is just a couple years after Smith died. One step above the sublime makes the ridiculous, and one step above the ridiculous makes the sublime again. So it's like you can get, we have a sense of the beauty, and we might have that loose, vague, and indeterminate sense of aesthetics, which help us all see the beauty in something. And then when, the very imaginative, creative person sees something beyond that, which no one else can see, he seems ridiculous. But if he can get people on board to see that next level, again, this is like the dialectic, it becomes sublime again, because we share that sense of that higher beauty.
Well, you can see that in art all the time. I think about The Rite of Spring, where Stravinsky had to escape from the concert hall through a bathroom window because they were going to kill him.
That's right.
They were so offended by the piece, and then eventually Sensibilities came to accept that as a masterpiece and an extraordinary. The other thing I think implicit in all this is, he alludes to it a few times, is there's definitely a sense of there's a theory of slapstick humor built into this book at various places. He talks more than once about that how a person can become a figure of ridicule, or I think he calls it raillery, which is meaning mockery and laughter, when something that is on the surface tragic is actually, because of the person's reaction to it, becomes a source of humor. And slapstick humor obviously is that phenomenon.
Yes, yeah, and the whole sort of tendency, penchant, I think I have certainly, to actually joke about these visionaries, okay? Even the ones that I truly greatly admire.
Who are you thinking about?
Oh, just, anyone who we consider like great, like Hayek and Monty Python was great on this, like the great figures, and then they would have them they would also turn it into raillery.
Yeah, sure. Puncture them.
Because there's always the sense of ridiculous in that aspiration. Yeah. Anyway, going on, I guess. He talks about the unsocial passions, hatred and resentment and other things like that, perhaps indignation. And he explains that these are always a little uncomfortable for us, if Jim is hateful or resentful towards somebody, because, there's conflict there with Jim and whoever he's resenting, and we have divided sympathy. Okay, yeah. We can't agree. It can't be one big happy family. It's not a feel-good situation.
Well, he actually very prominently says resentment's a bummer. It's a downer. People who are sitting around grousing and complaining all the time are no fun to be around. We'd rather be around happy people. And he says, even when we know the cause of their resentment, we'd have to be sympathetic to it to at least even consider it an attractive response. There's a lot of stuff in here about resentment. It's rather striking. It forces you to think a lot about how we deal with life's challenges. Because he's a big fan of sucking it up and moving forward and not complaining a lot. Right? He's not into whining.
That's true. I should say, though, that he does think there's definitely a place for hatred and resentment.
Oh, absolutely. And violence,
Yeah, revenge even,
yeah, sure.
Which I think is something we should remark on. But, yeah, if Jim is resentful towards somebody, we have to look at the other guy's side of the story. We don't want to, if we just sort of take Jim's side, again, we fall into being partial.
Yeah.
And so since there's conflict between Jim and the other guy, unlike gratitude, it's more difficult for us, and it's less pleasant. It's more challenging for us to enter into, and so he calls it an unsocial passion. It's not feel good, right? And in politics, we have feel good politics, right? That's where everything can be smooth and swimming together, and
trade-offs.
We're not going to punish the criminals. We're going to correct them, right? We're going to get everybody back together, and so I do think that politics. Although sometimes, when it's up against us versus them in the heat of the election and the negative campaigning, there is a real us versus them, and it's time for the unsocial passions. But when a party is in power and trying to make policy and put it over on society, it's very feel good, usually.
Always.
Yeah.
When you're talking about us versus them, you didn't mean from your own perspective. You meant from the politician's perspective.
Yeah, or just Republicans versus Democrats.
Yeah, partisanship.
Partisanship, right. But we have to learn how to resent then in a dignified way, and to do that gracefully, realizing that that showing a lot of resentment or hatred can be upsetting to our company, and also that sort of our company might also feel it's rude on our part because of other people in attendance who are also being inconvenienced by this undue resentment. So it's something we definitely need to learn to control and stuff. But at the same time, he definitely feels it's something which can be done in a dignified way and clearly should be. He's got this important footnote, which comes, I think, later. I think it's in section 1.
I think it is. That long footnote?
Yeah.
Very long
is it
footnote.
the very end of section 1? I'm flipping here. It is. It's on 76, 77, and 78. And this is important, I guess.
Is that in the first edition, do you know? I assume that was, he'd been criticized, and he added that after the fact. I don't know, but...
I was wondering that as well, because it's this extremely long footnote set off in smaller type here.
Somewhat defensive, too, I felt.
Yeah. On the other hand, I do not see any editorial indications that, by the editors that... it's anything but original.
Okay.
I could be just missing them somehow. But there's a lot in this footnote, but on this part of it anyway, he's saying that a lot of people take a... Sorry,
I think this footnote's actually in part 2, but in my version.
Oh, you're right, it is in part 2.
But you can go ahead.
We
can talk about it in part 1 if you think it's relevant for what we're talking about. Or do you want to just...
Yeah, why don't I just finish the thought here? Yeah. I think this is actually a really important footnote for a couple of reasons. I'll just touch the one. He's saying that many people take a kind of teetotaler approach to resentment and hatred. Kind of like those are, hate crime, like those you should never do, and you should never express them. You should never express indignation. And I think he's saying, this is the problem of the teetotaler, is that they're throwing it all away and not like a teetotaler, they're never drinking because they're afraid they can't manage a moderate and responsible and proper amount of drink. Okay? In other words, that they can't manage the judgment properly, and so they're like abstaining entirely.
Because they might become a raving, hateful maniac. So
Yes.
better to just turn that off.
That's right, something to that effect. But at the same time, it's real clear in his system that it's real important that you express these unsocial passions, because that's an important part of informing people about their reactions on you and their real, effects on your feelings and sentiments. We have to, check all those different sources of moral approval. And if the people affected are affected negatively and resent it and are not expressing it, that's something lost, right? And if people become too blasé about outrages and injustices, then we become complacent, right? We become docile in the face of outrages and injustices, which I think is a huge problem in academia, okay? And this is a whole part of that whole got to be positive and not normative type thing. In a sense, that's often just
economist is scientist rather than preacher.
Yeah, right. Don't be an advocate. Don't be outspoken. One of the readings of don't be normative is don't be outspoken.
Correct.
Which, being outspoken often expresses a sort of judgment and maybe a sense of resentment or, But if nobody's doing that, it kind of becomes blasé, and it becomes easier for these things to persist and spread. So he's saying, no, you don't have to be a teetotaler. In fact, I don't think he would be a teetotaler. I don't know if he drank, but no.
But there's a strong Aristotelian emphasis on moderation. Throughout the book.
Absolutely.
That you want to be in between the extremes that either that you feel, and therefore you should moderate them because of how you'll be perceived, or the extremes of how you act in response to an injustice or react to an injustice or a good deed.
Yeah.
So there's a very much in the Jewish tradition associated with Maimonides, an emphasis, a moral behavior is a question of moderation. That to go to extremes in either direction is unhealthy, even things that are good, because they're going to lead to the wrong thing. So an alcoholic is bad, and so is a teetotaler. The goal of life is to find a responsible way to drink. And similarly, when an injustice is done, you don't kill a person for jaywalking, and and he explicitly has that example. You don't give somebody the death penalty for having a bad motive. And doing something that through no fault of their own leads to a bad thing. And similarly, you don't say, well, how can you blame anyone? So to me, he's very much in that tradition of moderation.
Yeah. Judgment is a heady thing, can be a heady thing. And people may not be able to judge responsibly. And a lot of people then advocate or, not judging at all, as it were. George Stigler, in a way, I think, can be interpreted that way. It's like he couldn't judge responsibly the way Hayek and Friedman could. He was a whimsical, capricious guy. I think it's obvious. He couldn't judge responsibly, so he sort of damned judging entirely.
Interesting, yeah. I don't know if that's fair to him, but that's an interesting interpretation.
I'm sort of in the Deirdre camp.
I know you are.
Deirdre McCloskey camp on Stigler.
Yeah, I'm more sympathetic to him because personal connection, but maybe I'm biased too.
Then on the social passions, the sympathy is undivided. I mean, gratitude is a social passion where, you can kind of smile on both and everybody's like one big happy party, feel good thing.
What do you mean smile on both?
Well, Jim feels gratitude towards Rick. So they're both happy, they're not at odds. Mm-hmm. Rick was good to Jim. Jim is grateful to Rick. And it's like one big happy love fest.
Okay.
So it's like a social passion. Okay, he talks at length, some length about grief and joy. I think I'll just skip those. These are he suggests sort of very personal sentiments, and he says you shouldn't expect people to really be able to enter into them too much. He says
if you're too joyous about your financial success, they'll hate your guts.
That's right.
And so you should pretend that it's no big deal. And he talks about how hard it is to do that. It's very interesting.
Right. And he also says something very interesting, that prosperity, good things, actually never really lift us very high above our normal state of contentment or happiness, whereas very bad things can really devastate us. Yep. And so... of
course, he never had an iPod. So it's an interesting thing. In his world, it was prosperity outside of the upper classes was probably a very narrow range. There wasn't much to lift people up above much.
Yeah.
Right?
But I think it's true today, too. I mean, if I won the lottery... I don't think I'd be that much happier tomorrow.
No. This gets into I was struck a couple times that a lot of this relates to the issues that are in the so-called happiness literature today.
And behavioral economics.
For sure.
But anyway, because of these differences in ups and downs, people can never... Someone who wanted to try to sympathize with someone in real serious grief would have a lot farther to go. than somebody who's in prosperity and joy, because joy by nature is never that much. And so, if somebody is in prosperity and expects people to be really elated for them, we really don't get into that because we don't even believe he's that elated.
Yeah.
So Smith has the notion that losses loom larger than gains.
Yeah,
okay.
Very relevant for modern economics.
Yeah, very Thaler and
Not
so
just
on.
Thaler, diminishing marginal utility.
There's that too, but it's more than that. It's. I think it's clearly in the Thaler, Kahneman behavioral
correct
flavor.
Willingness to pay is not the same as willingness to accept of the same amounts.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a great deal in Smith that is being echoed today. In behavioral economics, there's that the process matters. He says that these points of propriety and gracefulness are often more important than the actual good little services you get in commerce or whatever it is. There's the process matters. There's just a great number of things that now are being discussed in behavioral economics. A couple of years ago, there was an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives about Adam Smith as a behavioral economist. It was an extremely interesting article to me. In this way, I mean, it was a good article. It was a nice article. I don't mean to knock it, but to some extent it read as, hey, look how great Smith was. He actually had the foresight to see some of the things we've now discovered. That behavioral sciences now, in the early 21st century, actually, brought to light in a scientific way. And my reading of the paper was like, doesn't this show how off track economics got? It's like Smith was talking about human beings not as mathematical functions, but as human beings. He had it all, not all there, but he was doing it.
He had a rich picture of human behavior.
Yeah, he had a human picture of human behavior. And then later on, I don't know when you want to say it started, but
1948, roughly.
Well, yeah, that's a notable year, but economists started thinking of the human being as a mathematical function. And that became a kind of shibboleth and cliche. Then I got attacked and blah, 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 even though in some sense a lot of economists never were saying that in the first place. And then we had the so-called behavioral movement to correct this, to advance science. But it's like coming back to Adam Smith, like they went off on the wrong track. And now great. Now we're back to 1759 and let's get back on the main road. Anyway, it's an interesting article. And in a way, I think the authors of the article had that other reading in mind. So it wasn't clearly one way or the other. I didn't mean to fault the article. It's a great article, actually. Anyway, we're coming into, Russ, this matter of ambition and pursuing rank and distinction.
And this, to me, was the most entertaining and fascinating part of part one.
Yeah,
it's really
and the most political as well. And one thing he says, again, is that it's the vanity that drives people towards this rank and distinction. It's not so much the notion that the greater wealth is going to make life that much more materially pleasurable. He says it's not the ease or the pleasure which interests us, but the vanity, the belief of our being the object of attention and approbation. Wanting attention, essentially.
So you go into rock music not to be rich, but to be loved. You go into Hollywood to be loved, not to be rich. You go into politics to be loved and not to be rich. Of course, you get rich too.
I think some of that is a little unfair to the rock stars and so on, but
right, because they're expressing themselves, right?
Right.
They're expressing a deep creative part, but the very few of them can escape the pursuit of glamour as part of the enterprise. Yeah. Because partly you could argue because they understand that the more glamorous they are perceived, the more wealth they'll command, right?
Yeah.
So it does interact in a very interesting way. But when I think of Hollywood, very, very few people come to mind who sort of are willing to be humble and not be on the cover of every magazine constantly. Tom Hanks is someone, we have that impression that he's just a normal guy. Of course, that's part of his shtick, too, but we have that. And in sports, we have the occasional athlete, Albert Pujols, who's the star of the St. Louis Cardinals. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend saying he's the best player, he's the best hitter in the National League, maybe the best player in baseball. Why isn't he more appreciated? Well, he's quiet. He's got a family. He doesn't seek the limelight. And most of them do. That's part of the game for whatever reason.
Yeah. Definitely all this question of celebrity is being discussed here. I do think that he does focus to a good extent on sort of political eminence and politics, and he does kind of get political here.
Tremendous.
And he says that the disposition of mankind is to go along with all the passions of the rich and powerful. And he talks about basically people being starstruck, being obsequious to these people, not, as he says very clearly, not necessarily out of any expectation of a favor or gain, but just they want to rub shoulders. They want to coordinate sentiment with, the powerful. And it's as simple as that. They want to rub shoulders with the big bosses.
Big shots, not so much the big boss. It's interesting. I think it's obviously a deeply true fact of human nature. It's extremely difficult to maintain one's judgment and balance in the presence of those folks, rich and powerful people.
I think so too. And they know it, and they know how to play it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah.
And so he does sort of have exhortations here about don't go into politics or, don't expect it to lead to happiness. And he speaks of two roads
that's
toward being respectable as well as being respected. One is through wisdom and pursuit of wisdom and virtue, and the other is towards wealth and greatness. And I think he does have a very political notion of greatness here when he speaks of greatness. And the one type of character who pursues wealth and greatness is proud ambition and ostentatious avidity, whereas the one who pursues wisdom and virtue is of humble modesty and equitable justice. He says the mob mostly admires the great and the ostentatious ones. And then he speaks of different how these pan out, or play out, I should say, for people in different stations in life. And of the middling and inferior stations, he's rather optimistic that it's actually through industry, honest dealings, virtue, actually, du commerce, to use the expression I think originally from Montesquieu, that commerce actually that commerce rewards virtue. And Smith, of course, wrote about this or lectured about it in the Jurisprudence, where he said that punctuality and probity are the chief virtues of a commercial society because of reputational mechanisms and so on. And there's also stuff in The Wealth of Nations, certainly along these lines. So he's got a rather optimistic view about virtue for the middling and inferior stations. And
and by that he just means people who aren't in the upper class, right?
Yes, I think that's right. Whereas for people in the upper class, he says that these are very diverging roads. That if you want to pursue greatness, you've got to not pursue virtue, essentially, and do all sorts of stuff that way outside the bounds of propriety and true fairness or wisdom and so on. He basically paints a very negative picture of political life and getting on in political life
and nobility. The so-called upper classes of his day.
Yes.
I couldn't help but be struck by how that might be a personal comment. He said you've got two paths. One path is celebrity, and the other is honest toil and virtue and wisdom. And I think he chose the latter, and it was sweet for him because he ended up with the former as well after his death, right? How many noble upper-class people of 1759 do we still talk about? 2 or 3, maybe. Yeah. How many? And Adam Smith is still discussed. So it's kind of ironic, but I felt there was a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, a little bit of, if I may use the word, I hesitate, but resentment, that's the way the world is. A little bit of defensiveness. That, there's two paths here. One of them is despicable. The other is noble. And I guess which one I chose. I don't know. It's just the feeling I got when I read it.
That's interesting. I'm not. You may be right.
Humble.
Yeah. The thing is with Smith is he's extraordinary in the cultural place that he actually had in his day. I mean, he really enjoyed a position of sort of cultural royalty even in his day. I do think that statesmen and politicians did come very much to solicit his, assistance and all that, and pay great attention to what he had to say. But
he wasn't just a humble professor toiling in a garret on a masterpiece.
He wasn't just that by any means. And culturally, he was the center, I think, and the jewel of his peers, the sort of Scottish moral philosophers, or at least came to be, particularly after the publication of this book, and onward. And that group of moral philosophers, moreover, were like a mountain peak in European culture generally. So you kind of have Smith as this king, this cultural king in a way, which is a very remarkable matter, and I think is very significant in understanding how he writes and the constraints on what he does. He's not some side character figuring I'll get in, my remarks as I can while I have a few listeners. He's sort of very aware. In fact, he's cultivating, I think, this position of cultural royalty. And to do that, I think you have to hedge what you say a lot. You have to cloak what you say a lot. I actually, listeners should know that I am definitely partial to having a sort of a more libertarian reading of Smith than most Smith readers. So I could be
trying to check you from time to time, even though I'd like that to be true, Dan.
I should be checked in this. I could be out of bounds on this, but I actually tend to think that Smith actually was even more in favor of the liberty principle than he let on, and partly for these reasons of cultural royalty.
So I stand corrected. It's not like he was. The reason I mention it is he keeps talking about the sacrifice that's involved, the seeming sacrifice that if you pursue this celebrity status, this upper class nobility status, that you're going to pay a heavy price for it. And I just wondered if perhaps there was a little bit of...
I think that's I think you're right, the more I think about it. Because, I say he's sort of the apex of a kind of cultural mountain peak, in some sense of all of civilized Western civilization culture at that time. But then again, culture and the arts and philosophy are not the only mountain peak, right? So there's another mountain there across the vista of politics and the kings. And in a sense, maybe you're absolutely right. He's sort of saying that I'm the top of this mountain peak. That mountain peak may even look taller and more awesome.
Which is ridiculous.
But it is ridiculous. They're not virtuous. They've gotten there, and it has selected people based on not being honest and
wise
and so on.
But what struck me about the only other point I want to make about it, and then we got to think about wrapping up. The only other point I want to make is what fascinated me about. First of all, the way he writes about it's highly entertaining, and it's a great section to read. But it's not enough to say these people are charlatans and emotionally juvenile because their satisfaction. Let me say it differently. He doesn't see any tension between these two views, which I hadn't thought about till this conversation. One is, he says there's a whole class of people who get all their pleasure from being adored and loved. But he fundamentally said that's what we are. That's what we are as humans. That's where we get our satisfaction, is striding through life, being respected. And he's saying, the way I took this section to read is two things. One is, well, some people are respected for reasons that really aren't terribly meaningful. Then there are those who are respected for good reasons, and those are the people who are wise and virtuous. These people who are rich and powerful, they're respected. They are adored and adulated and get all this attention and commanded. And yet there's something not real there. So that's the first thing I was struck by. The second thing is, I love this. He says, if you're in that group that is rich and powerful and you're getting all this love and affection and you fall from grace, it's over for you. Your life is ruined. You will never be happy again. Mm-hmm. And I think about this all the time when I think of it's in Evita, the musical, High Flying Adored, where she's this at the peak of her life at a very young age. And of course, this is true of a lot of these people we're talking about, athletes and entertainers. And of course, modern technology has allowed people and the baby boom generation has allowed all these people to sustain that over a much longer time than ever before. But it never gets any better than that when they're 27 and 28 for some of these folks. And he's really saying it's a curse. To be standing in front of a crowd, reaching out to you. Just my favorite example of this is Marilyn Monroe. Supposedly, I think it's probably a true story. She's married to Joe DiMaggio, and she comes back from her USO tour, and I think World War II or probably Korea, maybe. And she says, the way these people treated me, the love and the applause and the affection. She says, you can't imagine it. And he says, oh yes, I can. Because he had strode through center field in Yankee Stadium and had 70,000 voices chanting his name. I mean, that is such a seductive drug. And yet, once you can't have it, there's no substitute. And I think he says that extremely powerfully, and whether it was out of whatever the motives were, I think it's a deep truth about human beings that once you've reached that pinnacle, your ability to find a substitute source of happiness is not just you're never going to be as happy as you were when you were adulated like that. It's you're never going to be happy again. Now, in our time, Joe DiMaggio got to sign autographs and do Mr. Coffee ads and all kinds of things that kept him in the public eye. But for somebody who falls from the public eye, a politician, a rock star, an entertainer, as he's talking about, I think he's right. It's an oblivion that must be unbearable.
It makes sense. And it kind of relates, I think, to his egalitarianism, where I think he's got an egalitarianism in that he sees all humans as aspiring and rich and wonderful and, capable and potential of have all this potentiality. And he speaks of the rich and the powerful as despising the poor and the mean. And they develop all these attitudes in those very high walks of life, which actually kind of necessitate that probably to a great extent. And, they are being sucked up as sort of the king and the alpha male or whatever. And they lose their notions of propriety with respect to ordinary people in ordinary life. So then when they fall, they don't know how to go back into that in a way that's satisfying for them.
The world of equals. There's no more equals
the world
anymore.
of equals, exactly. I just wanted to, there's a bit more if we have a couple.
Yeah, 5 more minutes.
So back in where he's saying in the middling and inferior stations of life, virtue actually works. Honesty is the best policy, a kind of do commerce. Not that, I'm not sure that he mentions commerce in this paragraph, but clearly he says that.
When you say do commerce, you're speaking French.
Yeah.
Sweet dealings.
That's right. Sweet commerce.
Sweet business interactions.
That's right. Montesquieu said that commerce softens morals and customs and habits and practices. And it fits in with, like I said, about Smith seeing it ushering in punctuality and probity, basically honesty. So he says here that honesty is the best policy holds in such situations almost perfectly true. This is, again, in the middling and inferior stations of life. In such situations, therefore, we may generally expect a considerable degree of virtue, sort of in the ordinary people. And fortunately for the good morals of society, these are the situations of by far the greater part of mankind. Okay, let me just say a little bit more about the next sentence. It's a new paragraph, and come back to that. So he then draws the contrast. In the superior stations of life, the case is unhappily not always the same. In the courts of the princes, in the drawing rooms of the great, where success and preferment depend, not upon the esteem of intelligent and well-informed equals, but upon the fanciful and foolish favor of ignorant, presumptuous, and proud superiors. Flattery and falsehood too often prevail over merit and abilities. Now, I think it's so interesting that he says in the first part, the good part, fortunately, that for the good morals of society, these are the situations of by far the greater part of mankind. This fits into what I said about why I think, in a way, this book, though it's mainly about equals, is actually a political book. I mean, in other parts, it's explicitly political, but in some very broad sense, the whole thing is political, because I think he's saying, as much as society as we can should be like that.
Yeah.
He says, fortunately for the good morals of society. So the more that society is not governmentalized, right, and not dependent upon all the things that the way government works and government, the more that we will have virtue being the natural course towards happiness and improvement and advancement.
Well, it seems to me saying that for the bulk of the people, those of us in the middling and inferior stations, the rules of the game induce good behavior. In the upper classes, the rules of the game encourage malfeasance and destructive behavior.
But even specifically says the princes and the courts, it sounds even more political than just upper classes.
Yeah, well, that's what in his world, that's who he's referring to.
That's true, I suppose.
But regardless of how you want to read his motivation, it definitely is consistent with the public choice view of the dysfunctionality of the political incentives that that it talks about. That that this is not a well functioning set of incentives to attract high quality people who will serve their so-called political customers, the citizens.
Yeah, and it'll attract and select for people who are sort of weak in virtue, maybe even bad in virtue. I think of Hayek's "Why the Worst Get on Top." Mm-hmm. And then those are the people who set fashion, which we didn't mention, but they're the ones who set fashion. And so then they have this, deleterious influence on everyone else as well. So again, I do think this book very much leans towards degovernmentalization of society. Make it as much civil society only, or depoliticize as much as you can.
Well, to push against your libertarian impulse again, you could certainly read it as an indictment of the culture of celebrity and how celebrities literally set fashion and set morals and mores and norms. And I suspect he didn't think much of that. Wouldn't think much of that either in our time, when he's looking at I don't know, The Apprentice, a show I've never seen, but it's evidently about Donald Trump, who, because of his wealth and character and personas, is considered somebody we should try to emulate. And millions of people watch that show and want to be his apprentice, which is a bizarre thing.
Yeah. It's possible, and that might be what he meant by the shocking enormities, or gross distortions and shocking enormities from the superior paragraph we read last time.
No, I don't think so. I think that was about politics. I'm with you there.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
I'm just talking about the fashion part.
Yeah.
Both literal.
I think he'd probably not be enthusiastic, not be a fan, but sort of see it as, well, this is harmless compared to other bad things people could be doing, perhaps.
Could be. I don't know.
He does have in The Wealth of Nations saying that one way to divert the public and keep them from becoming fanatics in their own little sect is for the government to allow, just laissez-faire, shows, operas, buffoonery, lampoons.
World Wrestling Federation.
World Wrestling Federation or whatever. He actually, I think, League. Picked up on them satirizing the rich and the great. But he was certainly smiling on that there.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I hope those of you out there got something out of this. This was our first podcast on the details of the book, our second podcast overall. Our next episode will cover part 2, maybe part 3. Go to the book club page and follow the schedule there. And I hope you're enjoying it. And feedback always welcome. And please join us. And thank you, Dan, for this second podcast on the theory of moral sentiments.
My pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.